Hey, so I'm back today and I'm at the point where I'm wanting to put the bell housing on here and the flywheel and the clutch and all that stuff so I can finish the pieces on the front of the motor. Because to put the harmonic balancer on there, I need to torque it down, and to torque it down, I need the flywheel to be on the back so I can hold the crank from spinning. Anyway, I got these new motor stands on wheels that are just gonna bolt right up to the motor mounts on the block. And to get those on there, I got, well, my brother's here. I got this shop crane, also known as a BBC. That means a big, beautiful cherry picker. And so I'm gonna pick the motor up with that. And then I got this guy, which is gonna go on this valley cover here, which hopefully I can pull this off and not interfere with my steam vent kit. I'm gonna have to pull out the knock sensors, but that's no big deal. And then I'll get this thing mounted on there so I can lift the motor up, hook up the shop crane, and then get my new motor stands on there so I can expose the back here, get my dowels in there, start getting the pieces on. So I did have to disconnect part of the steam vent kit, and I got the valley exposed. I used my motor lift plate as a template to make this piece of cardboard just to block off this part while I'm lifting and moving things so I don't get a bunch of junk down inside of there. I'm gonna mount it on the back part of the motor because pretty soon I'm gonna have a transmission hooked up to it, and I don't want it to be leaning way too far towards the transmission. So I feel like if I mount it on this rear half rather than centered, it will hold the weight a little more level. We'll see if that happens or not. All right, got it hooked up. Let's see how balanced it is without a transmission on it. Well, the shop crane's working pretty well. I managed to access the bolts that are holding it on the motor stand, but when the new motor stands said hardware included, it meant just the hardware to put the casters on, not the hardware to hook the plates to the motor mounts. And as mine only utilizes one of 4 holes, I need to make a trip to the hardware store and get a couple of these. Well, went to the hardware store, bought 8 of the right size bolts, and then I went home to recycle the box that the motor stand came in, and this fell off the bottom. So I'll make another trip back to the hardware store and return the ones I bought and just use the ones that came with it. Now that it's on wheels and the back's exposed, I cleaned off the surface of the crank with a little bit of parts cleaner and a rag. Now I'm ready to install the flywheel. I got myself some ARP flywheel bolts, and per the directions, it takes medium strength thread locker on the threads and some of their fastener assembly lube underneath the head of the bolt. So I'm going to install it the same way as I would a factory flywheel with the factory bolts, except after I finish my final pass at 74 pound-feet of torque, I'm going to go to 85 pound-feet because that's what ARP calls for with their fasteners. What I'm doing now is snugging each of these bolts down just to get the flywheel seated against the face of the crankshaft. Once I get that done, I'm going to pull each one out one by one, apply the thread locker and the assembly lube, and then I'll make all my passes with the torque wrench after that. I'm putting just a small amount of the assembly lubricant under the bottom of the head of the bolt because I don't want to add too much in case it'll start spreading out to the flywheel. This needs to be a friction surface, so I don't want it to be covered in grease. And then I'm just putting a little bit of this medium strength thread locker on here. And there's our first one. So I made my first couple passes with the torque wrench, and when I got to my third pass, I started cranking the motor over. And so I got this tool here that bolts on where the starter goes, and these teeth grab onto the flywheel teeth and don't let it spin, and that way I can torque it down, and then once the flywheel's on, I'll be able to leave this tool on there and torque my harmonic balancer as well. Now with the help of this nice little tool, I was able to make my first 3 passes. The first was at 15, then the second was 37, the third was 74, and that's factory spec. And I'm gonna do my final at 85 for what ARP says, and I'm gonna tighten them in a crisscross star pattern. I'll just take some parts cleaner on a clean rag and just make sure that there's no finger oils or any residue on the face of this thing, and to make sure that none of this assembly lube is gonna get out of there and mess up what my clutch is trying to do. Before I went any further, I wanted to make sure that my crank flange and my flywheel were both parallel and flat as I rotated. So I got my dial indicator, I set it up pretty close to the outside of the friction surface of the flywheel, zeroed it out, and then I cranked the motor over with a wrench on the other side and would check this about every 16th of a rotation, and it never once skipped off a 0. So that tells me that my crank flange and flywheel are perfectly flat. So now I'll move on to the next step. Now I'm gonna get the harmonic balancer installed. I have a harmonic balancer with a keyway because my crank snout has a keyway on it. So I just get it started on there. And then I got this install tool, which I'm gonna thread the shaft of it as far as I can, all the way in, and then tighten the nut down to press it onto the snout of the crank as the first step in the process. Thank you to my dad and brother for letting me borrow their tools and saving me a bunch of money. The ARP harmonic balancer bolt is a 12.1 1/16 socket, which my dad had for me. And then my brother has a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench that goes higher than 150, which is as high as mine goes. And the requisite torque for this is 235 pound-feet. So I got both those over here and then realized that the dish of the harmonic balancer is too deep for this socket to reach. So I had to make another trip back to my dad's house, and thankfully he has 2 1/2-inch extensions for me to use. Now I'll be able to finish the installation of this guy. Per the ARP instructions, you're to lube underside of the bolt head, both sides of the washer, and all the threads of the harmonic balancer bolt. Shoot, that's tight. It hasn't even clicked yet. I'm a little bit concerned I'm gonna dump the engine over before I can get it to click. That's very tight.